He painted not what he saw, but what he felt.
The Sevaru Concord had catalogued 11,000 civilizations across 4 galactic arms, and in every single one of them, without exception, they had found the same underlying grammar of meaning. Information served function. A structure existed to shelter. A signal existed to communicate a fact. A sound existed to warn, to summon, to coordinate. Even the strangest species the Concord had ever surveyed, the crystalline Osivri, who communicated through slow mineral vibration over centuries, or the gas cloud Thalmari, whose entire society consisted of shifting chemical gradients inside a single planet's atmosphere, obeyed this law with perfect, comforting consistency. Meaning was a tool. Meaning pointed at something true or at something useful, and once you understood the pointer, the meaning dissolved into simple, closed, computable fact. It was this law, more than any weapon or engine, that had allowed the Concord to become what it was. A civilization of pure epistemic efficiency, 11 billion minds networked into a shared cognitive lattice called the Accord, capable of resolving any question posed to it, any question at all, within a bounded, predictable span of computation. The Concord did not have philosophers. It did not need them. It had solved philosophy the way it had solved fusion ignition and faster-than-light navigation. Completely, and a very long time ago. Archivist Prime Senuvar Thes had spent 400 years of subjective processing time inside the Accord's outer archival shell, cataloging the intercepted transmissions of 10,000 per-contact species, and had never once encountered a data anomaly that survived more than a few processing cycles before resolving into comprehensible structure. This made the discovery of Signal Cluster 7 Delta Human, an ever-thickening braid of electromagnetic noise radiating outward from a modest yellow star at the galaxy's dusty edge, a matter of only mild interest when it first crossed her attention threshold. The species calling itself human had been broadcasting into the void for barely 2 centuries, an evolutionary infant by any Concord metric. Its transmissions a chaotic sprawl of overlapping frequencies that the Accord's translation matrices sorted with characteristic efficiency into 3 broad functional categories within the first hour of analysis. Informational content, news, data, instruction. Coordinative content, military, commercial, administrative communication. And a third category so large, so persistently recurring, and so stubbornly resistant to functional classification that the Accord's matrices simply flagged it, in the driest and most understated language available to a machine intelligence that did not experience frustration, as unresolved. To understand why this single category of data would eventually shake a civilization 11,000 years old, it helps to understand what the Sevaru Concord actually was, at its foundation, beneath the gleaming spires of Concord Prime and the vast humming lattice of the Accord that bound its billions of citizens into a single coherent cognitive architecture. The Concord had not always been a civilization of perfect epistemic efficiency. Its own deep archival record, rarely consulted, carefully preserved, and almost never discussed in casual institutional conversation, showed that the species which would eventually become the Sevaru had once, in the earliest millennia of its recorded history, possessed something resembling what the humans called art. Crude pigment markings on cave stone, rhythmic percussive performance, accompanying communal ritual carved totemic figures whose function, even to the Concord's own ancient historians, had never been fully or satisfactorily explained. But somewhere across the following 8,000 years, as the Proto-Sevaru refined their neural architecture through successive generations of deliberate cognitive engineering, as they built the first primitive iterations of what would eventually become the Accord, as they gradually replaced the messy, unreliable business of individual subjective experience with the clean, verifiable comfort of networked collective consensus, that ancient category of unresolved expression had simply, quietly, without any single dramatic act of prohibition, stopped being produced. It was not banned. No law was ever passed against it. It had simply become, generation by generation, less necessary, because a civilization that could resolve any uncertainty through shared collective computation had gradually lost its need for a container to hold the uncertainties that resisted resolution. Until, 11,000 years later, it had lost the capacity to remember that such containers had ever existed at all, or that losing them had cost anything worth grieving. This was the deep, unspoken irony that would eventually surface in the Concord's own internal historical review, commissioned quietly by the Directorate in years following first contact with humanity. The Sevaru Concord had not encountered an alien and incomprehensible practice when its analysts first collided with human art. It had encountered, however faintly and however transformed by 10,000 years of separate evolutionary and cultural development, an echo of something it had once possessed itself, and had allowed, through no single villain's decision, but through the slow, comfortable erosion of collective efficiency, to simply fade away. The cave markings of the Proto-Sevaru and the swirling night sky of a dead human painter were not, on their surface, remotely similar artifacts. But the impulse behind them, the need, in a mind capable of feeling more than it could immediately explain, to put that feeling somewhere outside itself, to make it visible and shareable and permanent even without a resolvable purpose, was, Osirin would eventually argue in a supplementary report that several Directorate reviewers found more unsettling than her original mission findings, very possibly universal, not a human peculiarity, not a strange evolutionary accident specific to one small, obscure species at the edge of a minor spiral arm, a capacity every sufficiently complex mind might carry within it, waiting, dormant, for a civilization either young enough or brave enough to let it stay unresolved instead of engineering it quietly away. The unresolved category held paintings. It held symphonies and screeching electric guitar solos and quiet piano nocturnes that seemed to serve no coordinative function whatsoever. It held poems that used words in configurations that violated the plainest available reading of their meaning, a sea of grief, a heart on fire, a sky described as bruised, though skies could not, by any Concord definition, be injured. It held sculptures of the human form twisted into impossible, anatomically incorrect postures that no engineering document would ever tolerate. It held motion picture broadcasts in which humans performed events that had, according to cross-referenced informational content, never actually happened, invented people, invented cities, invented catastrophes, all constructed with evident care and enormous resource expenditure, for reasons the Accord's functional classification algorithms could not identify. Senuvar Thess flagged the category for deeper study with the mild, procedural curiosity of an archivist, noting an unusually persistent filing error, entered a standard research requisition, and moved on to the next signal cluster in her queue, entirely unaware that she had just opened the door to the single greatest cognitive crisis in the 11,000-year history of the Sevaru Concord. It took the Concord's automated systems 19 days to notice that unresolved had stopped shrinking. This was, in itself, a remarkable enough event to warrant flagging, because the Accord's classification architecture had been refined across 11,000 years specifically to prevent unresolved categories from ever accumulating unbounded mass. Any anomaly that failed to shrink under sustained analytical pressure was, by definition, either a sign of insufficient analytical resources being allocated to the problem, or a sign that the problem itself belonged to some entirely new category the Concord's existing frameworks had never been built to recognize. The Accord's automated triage systems, following 11,000 years of institutional precedent, assumed the former and quietly requisitioned additional processing cycles from 3 adjacent archival submines to accelerate resolution. It would be several more weeks before anyone senior enough to authorize a full survey mission began to suspect the second, far stranger possibility might actually be true. Every other flagged anomaly in the Accord's archive, and there were, at any given moment, several million minor unresolved classifications awaiting deeper analysis, eventually resolved. Given sufficient processing cycles, sufficient cross-referencing against known functional categories, sufficient patience from the tireless subminds assigned to chip away at them, anomalies collapsed into understanding the way ice collapsed into water, reliably, predictably, completely. The human art category did not collapse. It grew. Every new transmission the Concord's listening arrays pulled from the thin electromagnetic wash spreading outward from Saul added more material to the pile. More paintings, more songs, more strange invented stories about invented people doing invented things. And the deeper the analysis subminds dug into any single piece of it, the less functional sense it made, not the more. A 3-minute recording, cross-referenced 11,000 times against every known linguistic, cultural, and biological database the Concord possessed, revealed itself to be a song about a man missing a woman who was, according to every scrap of contextual data the subminds could lock. 8 not dead, not lost, not in any coordinative sense unavailable to him. She had simply left by her own choice, and he had chosen, for reasons the song itself never specified and seemed almost proud of not specifying, to spend 3 minutes describing the particular quality of rain outside his window instead. There was no instruction embedded in it, no warning, no coordinative value whatsoever. And yet the transmission had apparently been replicated, according to Concord signal tracking, across nearly 40 million individual human devices in a single calendar month. An investment of collective attention that made no sense at all for a piece of information that resolved, upon exhaustive analysis, to precisely nothing. It was Sevaru Concord who first suggested, in a formal report to the Concord's Xenopsychological Directorate, that human art might not be an anomaly awaiting resolution at all, but something the Concord had never before encountered in 11,000 years of contact. Information that was permitted by the culture that produced it to remain permanently, deliberately unresolved. The Directorate's response was not dismissal. The Concord did not dismiss anomalies. It studied them until they yielded, but something closer to bureaucratic disbelief. The particular flavor of institutional skepticism reserved for a claim so far outside established parameters that acting on it felt, to minds built entirely around the expectation of eventual resolution, faintly irresponsible. Director Concordant Vale Osirin, who had overseen the successful cataloging of 9,000 alien cultures across a 300-year career, and had never once filed a report that did not conclude in a clean, closed answer, requisitioned a full research vessel and a hand-picked team of 40 specialist minds to settle the matter definitively. The Sevaru Concord had solved philosophy. It would solve this too. It simply did not yet understand how small and strange the thing waiting for it actually was, or how badly it would need to be unsolved before anyone involved understood it at all. The research vessel Clarity's Edge dropped out of translite 17 light-years from Sol, well beyond any plausible detection range of a civilization. The Concord's preliminary threat assessment had rated, with characteristic understatement, as cognitively unremarkable, a species whose military technology sat centuries behind Concord's standard, whose planetary defenses barely registered as a footnote in any serious strategic calculus, and whose primary point of interest, so far as Director Concordant Osirin's mission brief was concerned, began and ended with the persistent, expanding puzzle of unresolved. The Clarity's Edge was not built for war. She was a slender silver spindle 2 kilometers long, her hull a lattice of receiver arrays and analytical cores rather than weapons batteries, designed across millennia of Concord engineering to do exactly one thing better than any vessel in the galaxy: listen, absorb, and understand. 40 specialist minds worked her interior in the specific and comfortable configuration the Concord had always found comforting, networked not merely through shared language, but through partial neural linkage into the Accord itself. Each individual thought accessible, cross-checkable, correctable by the collective the instant it strayed from established analytical rigor. It was, Osserin reflected as her vessel settled into a passive listening orbit at the edge of Saul's Uit field, precisely the team required to resolve a stubborn classification anomaly. It was decidedly not the team required for what actually happened next, because nothing in 11,000 years of conquered history had prepared any of them for a species whose art was not a puzzle with a hidden answer, but an invitation to sit, unresolved, inside a feeling that refused to explain itself. The first mind to break, though break, was a word the Concord's own medical directorate would resist using for months, preferring instead the clinical euphemism, recursive analytical destabilization, belonged to a junior analyst named Kesuvin Thrau, barely 80 years into his career, assigned to the comparatively simple task of processing a single archive transmission that human broadcast records cataloged under the title Starry Night. It was, by any conventional Concord metric, an almost embarrassingly minor piece of data, a two-dimensional visual composition, oil pigment on woven fiber canvas, depicting a small town beneath a night sky rendered in swirling, exaggerated bands of blue and gold that bore no resemblance whatsoever to any actual astronomical phenomenon the Concord's stellar cartography had ever recorded. Kesuvin's assignment was simple in principle: determine the functional purpose of the composition. Was it a coordinative map encoding some hidden astronomical data beneath its distorted surface? Was it a warning, a ritual object, a technical diagram disguised in decorative wrapping the way certain precontact species had once encoded emergency protocols into religious iconography? He ran the image through 11 separate analytical frameworks. He cross-referenced it against every scrap of biographical data the Concord's listening arrays had managed to assemble about its creator, a human named Vincent, who had, according to fragmentary historical broadcasts, died in poverty, largely unrecognized, having sold almost none of his work while he lived, a fact that made no sense whatsoever under any economic or coordinative theory of art the Concord's models could construct. Why produce something of apparently enormous value, something that would eventually be replicated, studied, and reproduced across the human species for over a century after its creator's death, and yet fail, during the creator's own lifetime, to secure him even the most basic material comfort? What kind of information economy permitted that kind of catastrophic, sustained inefficiency, and then reversed itself so violently after the fact that the object became priceless? Kesuvin submitted 17 consecutive analytical reports on Starry Night over the course of 9 subjective days, each one more strained than the last, each one reaching further outside established Concord frameworks to try to force the image into some shape of functional resolution. His 14th report proposed that the swirling sky pattern might encode a distress signal in visual form, a theory the directorate's senior review board rejected within minutes as inconsistent with every other data point about the artist's life and circumstances. His 16th report, submitted at an hour when the Accord's own monitoring systems noted his neural activity had begun exhibiting unusual recursive loop patterns, proposed instead that the painting might be a form of pre-verbal emotional data compression, an attempt to encode a subjective internal state, specifically agitation or anguish, into a shareable external artifact, without any accompanying functional payload beyond the raw transmission of that state from one mind to another. It was, in retrospect, astonishingly close to correct. It was also, to a mind built entirely around the expectation that all information ultimately served a purpose beyond itself, functionally indistinguishable from madness, because it required Kesuvin to accept that the human species had developed and sustained, across thousands of years and countless cultures, an entire vast industry dedicated to producing artifacts whose only function was the transmission of feeling for its own sake. No warning attached, no instruction, no resolution. No closed loop of cause and effect, just feeling, offered outward into the world and left permanently, deliberately open. His 17th report was never filed. Medical logs later recovered from the Clarity's Edge showed that Kesavan Thrall spent the following 6 hours in his private quarters running the same analytical loop over and over against the painting's image data, each pass identical to the last. His neural activity climbing into patterns the Accord's own diagnostic systems had never before recorded in a healthy Concord mind, not damage, not malfunction in any conventional sense, but something closer to a mind attempting, again and again, to close a door that the object itself had never intended to have a lock. When medical technicians finally reached his quarters, they found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, the starry night image projected in soft holographic light across the wall before him, murmuring the same designation over and over in a voice the ship's logs described as unusually, unprecedentedly quiet for a conquered mind, accustomed to the confident cadence of resolved analysis. It doesn't need to mean anything. It doesn't need to mean anything. It doesn't need to. He was placed under observation. He would not be the last. Director Concordant Vale Osirin, receiving the incident report in her command chamber, felt something she had not experienced in 300 years of a career built on clean, closed answers. A genuine, unresolved uncertainty about how to proceed. She convened her senior analysts, 39 minds remaining after Kesavan's withdrawal from active duty, and laid the problem out with the same procedural clarity she had applied to 9,000 prior cultural surveys. "We are dealing," she said, her voice carrying through the shared cognitive space of the Accord-linked chamber with the particular resonance that meant every mind present received her words simultaneously, without translation lag, without ambiguity, with a category of information that appears to resist functional resolution by design, rather than by accident or insufficient analysis. "I want confirmation. I want to know whether human art constitutes a genuine epistemic category the Concord has never encountered, or whether it is imply a very well-disguised functional system we have not yet correctly modeled, assign teams, cross-reference broadly, and monitor each other's analytical states." Analyst Thrall's destabilization event was not, I suspect, an isolated failure of individual discipline. I suspect it was a preview. It was a preview, and it proved impossible to contain through monitoring alone, because the very act of deep engagement with human art seemed to be the mechanism of destabilization itself, not some incidental byproduct that careful procedure could root around. Analyst Sevaru Concord, assigned to the study of human poetry, spent 11 days attempting to resolve a 14-line composition by a human called Emily, a poem that opened with the declarative statement, "Because I could not stop for death," and proceeded to describe in calm, almost conversational language, a carriage ride taken in the company of a personified abstraction that could not, by any biological or physical framework the Concord possessed, actually exist as a passenger capable of driving a carriage. Verl's initial analysis treated the poem as a coded description of an actual historical event, perhaps a funeral procession, encoded in metaphorical language for reasons of privacy or ritual custom, a theory consistent with practices the Concord had documented in 7 other pre-contact cultures. But the poem resisted that resolution at every turn, folding backward on itself, describing the passage of childhood, labor, and sunset as scenery glimpsed from the moving carriage, ending not with any closed narrative event but with the calm, almost peaceful observation that centuries had passed and felt, to the poem's narrator, shorter than the single day of the journey itself. There was no coordinative payload. There was no warning, no instruction, no hidden fact waiting to be extracted once the metaphor was correctly decoded. There was only a mood, constructed with exquisite technical precision out of images that did not resolve into any single fixed meaning even among human scholars themselves. The Concord's own signal intercepts revealed centuries of human academic disagreement about what precisely the poem meant. Disagreement the humans themselves seemed to regard not as a failure of understanding requiring correction, but as a legitimate, even valued feature of the work. This was the detail that broke something fundamental in Virul Cath's understanding of information itself. The humans did not want the ambiguity resolved. Entire academic institutions had been built, sustained, and funded for centuries around the practice of proposing new interpretations of works whose interpretations, once proposed, were explicitly not expected to eliminate the validity of every prior interpretation. Multiple contradictory readings of the same poem could apparently coexist, indefinitely, without either one being declared correct, and the other discarded, a state of affairs so alien to the Concord's entire epistemic architecture that Virul spent an additional 6 days simply trying to construct a logical framework in which two mutually exclusive interpretations of the same information could both be considered, simultaneously and without contradiction, true. The Accords shared cognitive lattice, designed across 11,000 years to synchronize belief and understanding across billions of networked minds into a single coherent, load-bearing structure of consensus knowledge, had no comfortable place to store a fact that was allowed to mean two incompatible things at once. Virul's neural activity, monitored continuously since the Kesuvin incident, began exhibiting the same recursive destabilization pattern on the 9th day, and by the 11th, she too was withdrawn from active analysis, found by her monitoring officer repeating, in a voice that had lost the crisp analytical cadence of a senior Concord mind, a single fragment of the poem over and over. Since then, centuries, and yet each feels shorter than the day. Feels shorter than the day. It doesn't resolve. It isn't supposed to resolve. It was not only the quiet, contemplative categories of human art that produced destabilization. If anything, the directorate's medical logs would later show, the more emotionally volatile categories proved considerably more dangerous to a mind unaccustomed to holding contradiction without resolving it. Analyst Torun Des, assigned to the study of human theatrical performance, spent 6 days working through a recorded stage production the humans cataloged as tragedy, a story, meticulously performed by trained human actors before a live audience, of a ruler undone by his own pride, his own family, his own inability to see clearly the forces arrayed against him, ending not in triumph or correction but in total, irreversible loss. The stage littered with the bodies of characters the audience had spent nearly 3 hours coming to know intimately. Torun's Annalie. Tickle frameworks initially treated the piece as instructional content, a formalized warning against specific behavioral failure modes, pride, wrath, poor judgment in matters of succession. Cross-referenced against real historical governance, failures the Concord itself had documented across its long history of surveying other species' collapsed civilizations. This reading held together tentatively until Torun encountered the recorded audience response data appended to the broadcast archive. Humans who watched this specific tragedy performed, again and again, across 4 centuries, in theaters on every continent of their homeworld, did not report the experience as instructional. They reported catharsis. They reported weeping, and afterward relief. A specific, repeatedly documented sensation of feeling lighter, cleaner, more able to face their own lives, having spent 3 hours watching invented people suffer invented consequences that had, in the strictest informational sense, taught them nothing they did not already know about pride or ambition or the fragility of power. Torun's 7th report to the Directorate, filed at an hour when his monitored neural patterns had already begun exhibiting the now familiar recursive instability, proposed with evident and mounting distress that the humans seemed to derive genuine, sustained value from voluntarily experiencing manufactured grief. on a schedule for pleasure. A category of behavior so far outside any framework the Concord's psychological models could accommodate that the report was flagged for immediate senior review, and Toran himself was quietly reassigned before a full destabilization event could occur, though the reassignment came by his own private admission to the ship's medical officer, roughly 2 days too late to prevent the doubt from ever fully leaving him again. Stranger still, and considerably more difficult for the Directorate's senior leadership to categorize as anything other than an active cognitive hazard, was the human category of comedy. Analyst Farron Ulsk, whose prior 3 centuries of service had been spent almost entirely in the comfortable, well-mapped territory of xenolinguistic structural analysis, was assigned what her supervising officer initially believed to be the least demanding task in the entire survey: the study of a single recorded human comedic performance, a solitary human standing before a live audience in a small, dimly lit venue, speaking for approximately 40 minutes about subjects ranging from the indignity of aging to the specific frustration of assembling flat-packed furniture, punctuated at irregular intervals by bursts of audience laughter whose triggering logic resisted every predictive model Farron attempted to construct. The performer, according to available biographical data, held no formal governmental or educational authority. The material contained no verifiable factual claims requiring correction or endorsement, and yet audiences returned to see this specific individual perform broadly similar material, night after night, city after city, for years, paying meaningful sums of currency for the privilege of hearing invented and mildly exaggerated complaints about furniture assembly delivered with precise comedic timing. Farron's analysis initially proposed that comedy served a social bonding function, synchronized laughter as a coordinative signal establishing shared in-group status among an audience, a theory with reasonable support in prior Concord xenosociological literature regarding ritual synchronized behavior in other species. But the theory collapsed under closer study because human audiences reported, with striking consistency across the Concord signal intercepts, that they laughed hardest not at material confirming ideas they already agreed with, but at material that reframed something painfully familiar: aging, loneliness, the slow accumulating absurdity of adult responsibility, in a shape that let them, for the length of a joke, hold the painful thing without it hurting quite as much. Farron's final report before her own temporary withdrawal from duty described comedy, in language the Directorate's senior reviewers found almost unbearably difficult to process without discomfort of their own, as a controlled detonation of a small emotional truth, timed precisely enough that the blast radius produces relief instead of damage. She did not fully recover her prior analytical composure for the remainder of the mission, though she would later tell colleagues, once the Concord's broader cultural exchange program had been formally authorized, that she had never in 3 centuries of service laughed at anything before that assignment, and had, in the months since, developed what she described only half apologetically as a private and difficult-to-explain fondness for human furniture assembly jokes specifically. Perhaps the most institutionally disruptive destabilization event of T. The entire survey, however, involved not a single analyst but an entire 6-mind review panel assigned to assess human architecture, a category the Directorate had initially expected to resolve easily, given that buildings, unlike paintings or poems or stand-up comedy, plainly served an obvious coordinative function: shelter, storage, the organization of communal activity. The panel's confusion began not with any building's practical function, which resolved cleanly and without incident in every case, but with the persistent, seemingly irrational human habit of investing enormous additional resources into forms of ornamentation that contributed nothing whatsoever to a structure's practical performance. Cathedral ceilings soared to heights far beyond any requirement of the space's stated function, supported by ribbed stone vaulting, whose structural elegance served no purpose the panel's engineers could identify beyond. As one dissenting analyst finally proposed after 8 days of fruitless functional modeling, making the humans standing beneath it feel small in a way they apparently wanted to feel. Public buildings across human history were carved with ornamental detail invisible from any distance close enough to matter for the wayfinding or structural purposes such carving might once have served. Decoration added seemingly for the specific pleasure of a passerby glancing upward and finding something unexpected and beautiful where pure function would have permitted a blank, efficient wall instead. The panel's chief engineer, a senior Concord mind named Sevaru who had overseen the structural certification of 40 separate Concord orbital habitats without incident, finally submitted a report whose closing line the directorate's archivists would later flag as one of the earliest formal acknowledgments, anywhere in Concord institutional record, that the survey mission's central premise might require complete revision rather than incremental correction. We have been attempting to locate the function hidden beneath the beauty. I now believe the beauty is not hiding a function. I believe, for this species, beauty is permitted to be the function in its own right, without further justification required, and our failure to locate anything beneath it is not a failure of analysis. It is confirmation that there was never anything further to find. By the 40th day of the Clarity's Edges survey mission, 6 of Director Concordant Osirin's 39 remaining analysts had experienced destabilization events severe enough to require withdrawal from duty, and the directorate back at Concord Prime, receiving her increasingly urgent reports through subspace relay, began to treat the situation not as an academic curiosity, but as something approaching a genuine cognitive hazard. The first of its kind the Concord had ever formally classified. It was around this time that Osirin made the decision that would define the remainder of the mission, and in ways none of her superiors could have anticipated, define the eventual trajectory of the entire Sevaru Concord's contact with the human species. Rather than continuing to feed individual human art pieces to isolated analysts for close study, a methodology that had proven, again and again, to produce destabilization the deeper any single mind engaged with any single work, she proposed submitting a broad, curated sample of human artistic output directly to a partitioned subsection of the Accord itself. A distributed cognitive process spanning several million linked minds rather than a single vulnerable individual, on the theory that a problem too large and strange for any one mind to resolve might yield to the Concord's greatest historical strength, the raw collective analytical weight of billions of networked intelligences working in perfect synchrony. It was, in hindsight, an understandable decision, born of 11,000 years of institutional confidence that had never once encountered a problem the Accord's collective weight could not eventually crush into resolved, comprehensible fact. It was also the single most consequential miscalculation in the recorded history of the Sevaru Concord, because what the collected weight of several million networked minds discovered, when it finally sat with the full breadth of human artistic expression rather than a single isolated fragment of it, was not a hidden functional structure waiting to be extracted. It was the accumulated, undeniable pattern of an entire species that had spent the whole of its recorded history building elaborate, resource-intensive structures explicitly designed to hold feelings that could not otherwise be held, grief that had no practical outlet, joy too large for any single coordinative report to carry, love and loss and longing and rage, and the specific unnameable ache of watching a sunset alone, all of it poured, deliberately, into paintings and songs and stories in stone, not because the feelings needed to be resolved into fact, but because human minds seemed to require somewhere to put them that was not simply forgetting. The partitioned Accord subsection processing this data, several million minds, linked in the deep synchronous cognition the Concord reserved for its most difficult unsolved scientific problems, encountered, within the first several hours of exposure. A symphony composed by a human who had, according to accompanying biographical records, been fully deaf for the final decade of his life, unable to hear a single note of the music he continued. With what the records described as fierce and increasingly desperate determination to compose, the accord subsection's analytical layers attempted, as they had with every prior piece, to resolve the composition into a coordinative function, a memorial, perhaps, or a technical demonstration of theoretical acoustic principles constructed independent of direct auditory feedback. But cross-referenced testimony from human listeners across 2 centuries, cataloged in exhaustive detail by the Concord's own listening arrays, described instead an experience that resisted every category the accord possessed. Descriptions of the piece as transcendent, as capable of producing physical tears in listeners who had suffered no injury and faced no danger, as an experience so intense that concert recordings showed audiences rising to their feet in prolonged, spontaneous physical display that served no coordinative purpose. The Concord could identify beyond the apparent shared acknowledgement that something significant, something worth marking with the body rather than merely the mind, had just occurred. A man who could not hear his own music had built something that made an entire species, 2 centuries later and scattered across an entire planet, stand up and weep, and there was no hidden functional payload buried beneath that fact waiting to be extracted. The fact itself, unresolved and irreducible, was the entire point. The partitioned accord subsection did not experience destabilization the way individual analysts like Kesuvin Thrall and Viril Kaith had. It experienced something considerably stranger, something the Concord's own emergency protocols had genuinely never anticipated needing to name. Across several million networked minds simultaneously processing the full accumulated weight of human artistic output, the paintings, the symphonies, the poems, the desperate deaf composer and the impoverished painter, and the woman who wrote about a carriage ride with death and thousands upon thousands of other works besides, each one individually resistant to resolution and collectively, catastrophically overwhelming, something in the accord's deep architecture began to shift, not break, shift. Several million minds that had spent 11,000 years of collective existence believing, with the calm, unquestioned certainty of a civilization that had never been meaningfully challenged, that all information ultimately resolved into closed, functional, shareable fact, found themselves instead sitting inside something that refused to resolve, and discovered, to the Directorate's mounting alarm, that they did not actually want it to. There was something in the unresolved feeling itself, something in simply being permitted to hold a piece of information that pointed at nothing beyond the feeling it produced, that the collective found, against every predictive model the Concord psychologists could construct, genuinely, powerfully compelling. Director Concordant Osirin watched the Accord subsection's status report scroll across her command display with an unease that had, by this point in the mission, become a near-permanent condition, and made the decision to formally suspend the collective processing experiment before it could progress further. Uncertain whether she was protecting several million minds from a genuine cognitive hazard, or simply interrupting the first authentic emotional experience any part of the Concord had undergone in 11,000 years of purely functional existence, it was too late to fully contain the effect. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes rippled outward through the Accord's broader network, changes the Concord's own diagnostic architecture struggled to classify because they did not resemble malfunction in any conventional sense. Minds that had processed even brief exposure to the human art archive began, in small but measurable numbers, requesting access to additional samples, not for further analytical resolution, but for what internal Concord communications, translated later for human researchers, awkwardly termed continued unresolved engagement, a phrase that Concord bureaucracy struggled mightily to define in terms compatible with 11,000 years of prior institutional language. It was at this point, roughly 70 standard days into the Clarity's Edges survey mission, that Director Concordant T. Osirin made the decision that would ultimately define the entire encounter. Rather than continue observing humanity from the concealed safety of the outer Uit field, she would authorize direct contact, on the theory that no amount of remote analysis was going to resolve a phenomenon that appeared, increasingly, to require direct engagement with its source to be understood at all. It was, by any conventional Concord risk assessment, an enormous gamble. First contact protocols across 11,000 years of prior conquest and diplomacy had always proceeded from a position of overwhelming informational and technological advantage, never from a position of genuine, admitted confusion. But Osirin had watched 6 of her finest analysts withdrawn from duty, had watched several million networked minds develop something dangerously close to an unauthorized emotional preference, and had concluded, with the particular clarity that comes only from genuinely running out of alternatives, that the Concord's entire epistemic framework required direct correction from the one source capable of providing it. The Clarity's Edge made her approach to Earth with full transparency, running active beacon signals and open diplomatic broadcast channels rather than the passive, concealed observation that had characterized the mission's first 70 days, a decision that produced, on the human side of the encounter, a response Osirin's threat models had entirely failed to anticipate. No panic, no scrambled defensive mobilization, no frantic diplomatic improvisation. Human orbital monitoring stations detected the alien vessel's approach within hours, cataloged her trajectory and hull configuration with calm, professional thoroughness, and responded through a modest, unassuming communications relay with a message, so understated it briefly confused the Concord's translation matrices entirely. A formal, polite request for the visiting vessel to identify its diplomatic intentions, appended with an offer, extended, apparently, as a matter of standard first contact courtesy, to connect the Concord delegation with a small interdisciplinary team of human curators, should the visitors wish to discuss cultural matters during their stay. Osirin stared at the translated message for a long moment in her command chamber, struck by the surreal, almost dreamlike ease with which humanity appeared to have anticipated the exact nature of the Concord's confusion before a single formal word of it had been exchanged. The meeting took place, at human suggestion, not aboard any orbital defense platform or fortified diplomatic compound, but inside a modest public building in a coastal human city, a structure the humans called, with characteristic understatement, a museum, a place. Osirin's translation matrix informed her with some difficulty, whose entire architectural and institutional purpose was the deliberate collection, preservation, and public display of exactly the category of unresolved artifact that had spent the last 70 days quietly unraveling the confidence of the most epistemically stable civilization in the galaxy. Osirin descended to the surface with a delegation of 6 senior analysts, deliberately excluding Kesuvin Thral and Vural Kath from the party despite their protests, unwilling to risk further destabilization of minds already fragile from prior exposure. She was met inside the museum's echoing central hall by a small delegation of human representatives led by a woman, introduced simply as Dr. Naomi Whitfield, curator of modern and contemporary art, who greeted the Concord delegation with an expression of open, evident curiosity that Osirin's translation matrix flagged, with something approaching bafflement of its own, as containing no discernible trace of fear. "You've been listening to our broadcast for a while," Dr. Whitfield said, once the formal diplomatic courtesies had concluded, and the Concord delegation stood arrayed before a wall hung with paintings whose swirling, deliberately imprecise brushwork made several of Osirin's analysts visibly tense with the same recursive unease that had claimed Kesuvin Thral 70 days earlier. long enough to build a whole survey mission around it, if I'm reading your vessel's configuration correctly. I'm guessing you're not here about the news broadcasts. Her tone carried no particular triumph, no diplomatic advantage-seeking, only a kind of gentle, professional patience that Osirin found, against every expectation her threat models had constructed, disarming. "We are here," Osirin said, through the translation array, choosing her words with the careful precision of a mind attempting to maintain analytical composure in the presence of an admitted, ongoing failure, "regarding a persistent classification anomaly in your species' informational output, a category your own language identifies as art. Our analysis indicates that this category does not resolve into fun. See Shanao, coordinative meaning through any framework our civilization possesses. 6 of our analysts have experienced severe cognitive destabilization attempting to process it. A partitioned subsection of our collective intelligence, several million minds in scale, began exhibiting anomalous behavioral preferences after extended exposure. We require clarification regarding the fundamental purpose of this category of information, because our own analytical architecture has proven insufficient to derive it independently." Dr. Whitfield was quiet for a moment, and Osirin watched something shift across the human woman's face that the Concord's translation matrix, still calibrating on 70 days of prior analysis, tentatively flagged as sympathy. An emotional category, the Concord possessed a technical definition for but had rarely, in 11,000 years of largely one-sided conquest and diplomacy, had genuine occasion to receive from a species it had approached in a position of open confusion rather than overwhelming strength. "I think," she said finally, "the thing that's breaking your analysts is that you're looking for the door out of the room and there isn't one. There was never supposed to be one. That's not a flaw in the room. It's the whole point of building it." She gestured toward the wall of paintings behind her, their imprecise, deliberately unresolved brushwork glowing softly under the museum's careful lighting. "We don't make these things because we've hidden a fact inside them that you're supposed to dig out and then discard the container. We make them because some things, grief, love, the specific ache of a particular sunset, the exact weight of missing someone who chose to leave, don't survive being turned into a clean, resolved fact. The moment you resolve them, you've killed the actual experience of them. Art is the container that lets you carry the feeling around without flattening it into something smaller than it actually is. It's not a puzzle with a missing answer, director. It's a place to put the things that don't have answers, so you're not carrying them alone, unheld forever." The Concord delegation stood in silence for a long moment inside the museum's echoing hall, 6 analysts and their director absorbing a piece of clarification that resolved, in the most literal and devastating sense, absolutely nothing. Because what Dr. Whitfield had just offered them was not a hidden key that would finally allow human art to collapse into comprehensible Concord function. It was confirmation, delivered gently and without any trace of malice, that no such key existed, had never existed, and was never, by the deliberate design of the species that had built the category, meant to exist at all. Osirin felt something move through her own carefully maintained analytical composure in that moment, a small, quiet echo of the same destabilization that had claimed Kesuvin Thrall 70 days earlier, and understood with sudden and total clarity precisely why it had happened to him, and why it was, in that very instant, beginning to happen to her as well. Not because human art was a threat, not because it concealed some dangerous or hostile payload requiring urgent defensive analysis, but because it was an invitation into a mode of understanding the Concord, had simply never needed to develop across 11,000 years of civilizations that had all, without exception, played by the same closed, resolvable rules the Concord itself had always assumed were universal. "May I ask," Osirin said, after a silence that stretched long enough for 2 of her junior analysts to shift audibly with discomfort, "how your species tolerates this? How you build entire institutions, entire economies, entire lifetimes of labor around objects that deliberately refuse to resolve. Does it not? She paused, searching for a word her own language had never needed before this mission, and settled with evident difficulty on the human term itself. Does it not hurt to hold something permanently open? Dr. Whitfield considered the question with the same unhurried patience she had shown throughout the exchange. Sometimes, she said. Yeah, sometimes it hurts a lot, but I think the alternative you're describing, a world where every feeling has to resolve into a closed, useful fact before you're allowed to have it, sounds a lot lonelier than anything hanging on this wall. We don't tolerate the openness, Director. We need it. It's how we know we're not alone in feeling the things that don't have answers. Somebody paints the specific loneliness of a night sky, and 130 years later someone standing in front of that same painting feels, for just a second, a little less alone in their own version of that same loneliness. That's not a malfunction in our information systems. That might honestly be the most important thing we've ever built. The exchange did not end there. Dr. Whitfield, apparently sensing at a single answer, however carefully constructed, was unlikely to satisfy a delegation that had spent 70 days trying to dismantle a category of experience down to its functional bones, led the Concord delegation deeper into the museum's quiet halls, past galleries of sculpture and photography, and a long, dim corridor devoted entirely to what the placards called outsider art, work produced not by trained professionals operating within recognized institutional traditions, but by ordinary humans, often untrained, sometimes explicitly troubled, who had simply needed, for reasons that resisted every category the Concord's earlier analysis had proposed, to make something. Osirin paused before a canvas covered edge to edge in small, obsessively repeated spirals, painted by a human whose accompanying biographical note described decades spent in psychiatric institutional care, and asked, with what her translation matrix rendered as unusual hesitancy for a mind of her rank and experience, whether this particular piece represented an aberration within the broader category, a symptom of malfunction rather than a genuine example of the artistic practice she had been sent to understand. Dr. Whitfield considered the painting for a long moment before answering. I think that's actually one of the most honest pieces in this whole building, she said. He wasn't trained. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or sell anything or fit into any tradition. He just had something moving through him that he had no other way to get out, and this was what came out when he let it. We don't hang it here because it's technically perfect. We hang it because it's true in a way that's hard to fake, and because it reminds everyone who walks past, including the very trained, very credentialed artists in the next gallery, that the whole reason any of this exists in the first place isn't technique, it's need. She glanced sideways at Osirin, and something in her expression softened further, into something the translation matrix flagged, tentatively, as recognition. You're doing the same thing right now, Director, whether you realize it or not. You came 70 light years because something about this kept pulling at your people even after every analytical framework you had told you it shouldn't. That pull isn't a malfunction either. It's the same thing that made him paint the spirals. It's the same thing that makes anyone make anything. You're not as far outside this as you think you are. Osirin did not answer immediately. She stood before the spiral painting for what her own internal chronometer would later record as nearly 4 full minutes, an eternity, by Concord diplomatic standards, for a delegation head to remain silent before a subordinate host during a first contact proceedings. And when she finally spoke again, it was not to Dr. Whitfield, but to her own delegation, in the clipped, formal cadence of an official instruction rather than a personal reflection. Record everything in this hall, she said. Full spectral and dimensional capture every piece with accompanying biographical and contextual notation wherever the curators are willing to provide it. I want the complete record transmitted to the directorate alongside my report. She paused and added, in a tone that made two of her junior analysts glance at one another with poorly concealed astonishment. "And I want a copy retained aboard the Clarity's Edge, separate from the official archive, for continued reference." The formal diplomatic proceedings that followed over the next several days settled, with surprising speed given the strangeness of the circumstances, into a framework neither side had anticipated needing when the mission began. Not a treaty of trade or mutual defense, the customary instruments of Concord first contact, but what the human delegation, with characteristic bureaucratic modesty, termed a cultural liaison agreement, a standing arrangement permitting ongoing, voluntary exchange of artistic and creative material between the two civilizations, monitored on the Concord side by a small, dedicated research office, rather than folded automatically into the vast, undifferentiated churn of the Accord's collective processing. Human negotiators, Osserin noted with some private astonishment, seemed entirely unsurprised by the request, and even faintly amused by the elaborate caution with which the Concord delegation insisted on medical safeguards and exposure limits for any Concord mind, engaging with the material safeguards that Dr. Whitfield, sitting in on the final session, gently observed were not so very different from the content warnings human institutions had spent over a century learning to attach to their own most emotionally intense work, for their own audience's benefit, long before any alien civilization had ever had occasion to ask. Osserin returned to the Clarity's Edge that evening carrying, in addition to a formal diplomatic record, of first contact that would need to be filed and reviewed by the full directorate, a small, carefully wrapped physical print of one of the paintings from Dr. Whitfield's museum, an offering the human curator had pressed into her hands with an expression of quiet, genuine warmth at the conclusion of their meeting, insisting, over Osserin's polite procedural objections, that the Concord delegation could not possibly leave without something to actually sit with rather than simply analyze. Osserin kept it in her private quarters for the remainder of the survey mission, and though her official reports to the directorate would continue, for appearance's sake, to describe human art as an unresolved classification anomaly requiring further study, she found herself, in the quiet hours between duty shifts, returning to the small print again and again, not searching any longer for the hidden function it must surely contain, but simply, deliberately, sitting with the specific, unnameable feeling it produced in her, an experience that resolved into nothing at all, and that she found, against every expectation 11,000 years of conquered certainty had built into her, that she did not particularly want resolved. The formal report Director Concordant Vale Osserin eventually filed with the Sevaru Concord's directorate ran to nearly 400 pages, and its concluding recommendation, that the Concord suspend further attempts to functionally resolve human artistic output, and instead authorize a small, carefully monitored cultural exchange program to allow willing Concord minds to engage with it directly, under the same principle of open, unresolved reception the humans themselves seem to apply, produced a debate within the directorate's senior leadership that would stretch on, without full resolution, for years afterward. It was, in its own quiet way, the single strangest outcome any first contact mission in Concord history had ever produced. Not a treaty, not a trade agreement, not the customary humbling demonstration of overwhelming force that had characterized the Concord's rare prior encounters with civilizations it judged worth the effort of formal contact, but an admission, filed in the driest and most procedurally careful language available, that an empire of 11 billion networked minds, capable of resolving any question posed to it within a bounded and predictable span of computation, had finally encountered a category of information it did not want to resolve, and had discovered, entirely by accident, that there was something on the other side of that discomfort worth keeping. The years that followed first contact would come to be known, in the small and initially obscure academic circles that formed around the Concord's new cultural liaison office, as the unresolving, a period during which the rigid, comfortable certainty that had defined 11,000 years of Sevaru civilization began, slowly and unevenly, to develop something it had never possessed before: room for disagreement that did not require correction. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen without resistance. A significant portion of the Concord's senior leadership, including several members of the directorate who had approved Osirin's original survey mission, expecting a tidy resolution to a minor classification anomaly, argued forcefully in the months after her return that the entire human art exchange program represented an unacceptable cognitive hazard, a slow poison being voluntarily introduced into the Accord's otherwise flawless collective architecture, and pressed for its immediate and total suspension. Director Concordant Osirin, called before a formal directorate review to defend her recommendations, did not attempt to argue that human art was safe, precisely, in the narrow sense her critics meant the word. She argued instead that safety, defined as the total elimination of any information that could not be immediately and completely resolved, was not a value the Concord had ever actually needed, until it had encountered a mirror strange enough to make the cost of that safety visible for the first time in 11,000 years. "We have built the most stable civilization in the galaxy," she told the assembled review board, in a statement later reproduced, with some irony, as a kind of poetry in its own right by the very cultural historians her mission had inadvertently created. "We have also, I now believe, built the loneliest one because we removed, generations ago, the one practice every other species we have surveyed still uses to tell each other, across the gap between one mind and another, that they are not alone in the things they cannot fully explain. I am not asking the directorate to abandon what has made us strong. I am asking it to consider that strength and wholeness were never, in fact, the same value, and that we mistook the first for the second for longer than any of us are entirely comfortable demitting." The review board did not immediately vote to expand the program, and for a period of nearly 2 years, the Cultural Liaison Office operated on a deliberately narrow, tightly monitored charter, its access to new human material rationed carefully by a small oversight committee wary of triggering further destabilization events among an already strained population of specialist analysts. But something had already shifted too far to be fully contained by institutional caution. Word of the survey mission's findings, carefully redacted in official channels, but impossible to fully suppress within a civilization as thoroughly networked as the Concord, spread through informal channels among ordinary citizens who had never set foot aboard the Clarity's Edge, who had never personally studied a single human painting or poem, and who nonetheless found themselves drawn, in small but steadily accumulating numbers, to petition the directorate for expanded access to whatever fragment of this strange, new category of experience the Cultural Liaison Office was willing to share. The Concord's own artists, a small, historically marginal community that had, until first contact, produced work almost exclusively within narrow, functionally justified categories such as architectural ornamentation or ceremonial performance, tolerated rather than celebrated by a civilization that had never quite known what to do with them, found themselves, for the first time in living memory, the subject of genuine institutional curiosity. Invited to study the newly translated human archive alongside the directorate's own specialist analysts, in the hope that some spark of the ancient, half-forgotten proto-Sevaru impulse might be coaxed back to life by proximity to a species that had never let it go out at all. Kesuvin Thrall, whose destabilization before the Starry Night image had marked the opening incident of the entire crisis, became, in the years following his recovery, one of the Cultural Liaison Office's most requested lecturers, not despite his earlier breakdown, but because of it, because the very vulnerability that had once been treated as a professional failure was gradually, uncomfortably, being recognized within the Concord's shifting institutional culture as something closer to the opening note of an entirely new kind of understanding. He would tell audiences, in talks that drew increasingly large crowds of ordinary Concord citizens, rather than the narrow specialist circles his career had previously occupied, that the 6 hours he had spent on the floor of his quarters repeating the same fractured phrase over and over had been, in retrospect, the first moment in 80 years of his life that he had genuinely felt something he could not immediately explain, catalog, and file away, and that as frightening as that moment had been, he had never afterward been able to fully convince himself he wanted to go back to a mind that had never felt anything it couldn't explain at all. Kesuvin Thrall, when he was finally cleared to return to limited duty 6 months after his withdrawal, requested, against the strong recommendation of the ship's medical directorate, who worried the exposure might trigger a relapse of his earlier destabilization, a final formal session with the starry night image that had first broken something open in his carefully ordered understanding of what information was allowed to be. He sat with it for 11 minutes in complete silence, the swirling blue and gold light washing quietly across his face, and when the session concluded, his report to the directorate contained a single line that would eventually be quoted, translated into a dozen human languages, in an art history lecture delivered at a small coastal museum a decade later, to a room of students who would never fully understand the 11,000-year weight of certainty it had taken an entire alien civilization to finally set down. I no longer require it to mean anything. I only require it to keep meaning something different every time I look, for as long as I am permitted to keep looking. Somewhere in the vast, humming architecture of the Accord, several million minds that had once processed the full weight of human artistic expression and found themselves unable to simply let it resolve into closed, forgettable fact quietly agreed, and did not, for the first time in 11,000 years of perfect collective consensus, feel any particular urgency about closing the question at all. On Earth, Dr. Naomi Whitfield's museum quietly added a small new placard to the corridor of outsider art, beside the spiral painting that had held Director Concordant Osirin's attention for 4 uncharacteristic minutes on the day of first contact, noting for visiting schoolchildren and casual weekend wanderers alike that this particular work now hung, in a very literal and verifiable sense, in the collective memory of a civilization 11 billion minds strong, 70 light-years away, that had come to Earth expecting to solve a puzzle and had left instead having simply agreed to keep looking at it. Human researchers, granted their own reciprocal access to fragments of the Concord's ancient, half-forgotten Proto-Sevaru cave markings under the terms of the new Cultural Liaison Agreement, found the images strange and moving in ways their own academic papers struggled to fully articulate, not because the markings resembled anything in human tradition, but because of what their long absence and the difficulty of their eventual rediscovery seemed to say about how easily even a species built entirely around understanding could still lose track, given enough time and enough comfortable certainty, of one of the oldest and simplest reasons any mind anywhere had ever had for making something in the first place. Not to explain the feeling, but to prove, to some other mind separated by distance or time or the vast, unbridgeable gap between one species and another, that the feeling had been real and worth keeping and never entirely alone. Fleet analysts aboard 3 subsequent Concord survey vessels, dispatched in the years following the Clarity's Edge's return to study other newly contacted species, with a considerably more open charter than Osirin's original mission had been granted, began quietly, unofficially, including a standing question in their initial cultural assessments that would have been unthinkable in Concord diplomatic protocol a decade earlier. Not merely what does this species build, or what does this species need, but what does this species make that serves no purpose beyond the making of it, and would they be willing, if asked gently and without threat, to show us? It was not a question 11,000 years of Concord history had ever needed to ask before humanity forced it into the language of formal diplomatic inquiry. It would not, the Directorate's own historians increasingly suspected, be the last time that question changed the shape of everything the Concord assumed it already understood about the galaxy it had spent so many careful, resolved, unquestioned millennia, believing it had already completely figured out.